A millionaire adopts an orphaned albino boy to everyone's surprise. A few days later, expensive paintings in his house suddenly and mysteriously disappear, making everyone think. A lone streetlight flickered above the park's entrance, casting long, jagged shadows over the pavement. The night air was damp, thick with the scent of rain that had yet to fall. Somewhere in the distance, a siren howled, its cry stretching through the hollow streets before fading into silence. The world felt unnervingly still, as if it were holding its breath. Marilyn Reed walked with slow, measured steps, her arms wrapped tightly around the small bundle pressed against her chest. Her coat was thin, barely enough to shield her from the biting wind, but she hardly noticed the cold. The baby in her arms stirred, letting out a small, breathy whimper, and she flinched as if burned. She had told herself she wouldn't hesitate, that she would walk into the park, find a secluded spot, and leave. No second guessing, no turning back. But now, standing beneath the dim glow of the street lamp, she felt paralyzed. The baby let out another sound, a soft, searching noise, and her grip instinctively tightened. She shouldn't have looked, but she did. A pair of barely opened eyes, pale as morning fog, peered up at her. His tiny mouth twitched, his fingers, no larger than flower petals, curled against the edge of the blanket, and for a moment Marilyn swayed on her feet, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't just any child. This was hers. A tremor ran through her as memories surged forward, unbidden and cruel. The cold tile floor of her parents' house when they had turned their backs on her. The sharp bite of her father's words, a disgrace, a ruined girl. The long nights spent alone, the weight of growing hunger, the exhaustion so deep it seeped into her bones. And then the moment she had first seen him, small and fragile in the hospital bassinet, with hair so white the nurses had whispered behind their hands. Marilyn squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself not to feel, not to think. But emotions didn't obey logic. They swelled, tightening around her throat, making it hard to breathe. She had nowhere to go, no home, no money, nothing. What kind of life could she give him? She forced herself to move, one unsteady step at a time, until she reached the old wooden bench near the park's edge. The slats of the bench were rough beneath her fingertips as she slowly, carefully placed the baby down. His whimpers turned into a restless cry, the sound slicing through the quiet like a blade. Her chest ached, but she ignored it. "Someone will find you," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Someone who can give you a life I can't." She stepped back. Once, twice. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, scattering dried leaves across the pavement. A soundless sob built in her throat as she turned on her heel, forcing herself to walk away. One step, then another. And then she ran. She ran as if the night itself chased her, as if by outrunning the moment, she could outrun the weight of what she had done. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, her vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. Don't know how long after, having something inside her twisted violently, an instinct so primal it clawed at her sanity. Go back. Now. She stumbled to a stop, gasping, her hands shaking. A deep, awful silence had settled over the world. She turned, dread blooming in her chest. Her feet moved before she could think, carrying her back toward the bench. The wind had died, the trees stood still, and the streetlight overhead flickered once, then twice. The bench was empty. Marilyn's breath caught. Her eyes darted left and right, searching the darkness. Her pulse slammed against her ribs. "No." Her voice was barely a whisper, fragile and breaking. She rushed forward, hands gripping the cold wooden slats, as if somehow she could force time to rewind. But the only thing left behind was a faint imprint on the bench, a ghost of warmth quickly fading in the night air. A strangled sound tore from her throat as she stumbled back, her legs suddenly weak beneath her. Someone had taken him, Her baby. Marilyn turned wildly, scanning the empty park, but there was no one. No footsteps. No sign of movement. The night had swallowed him whole. The weight of the moment crashed over her, drowning her in a tidal wave of horror and regret. And then, for the first time in years, Marilyn Reed collapsed onto the pavement and wept. A few minutes ago, the air smelled of damp earth and stale city smoke, the kind of lingering scent that clung to buildings after a long, cold evening. The glow of flickering streetlights stretched shadows across the cracked pavement, stretching and twisting as the wind picked up. Somewhere beyond the empty streets, a dog barked, its sharp cry echoing through the quiet. Ms. Calloway pulled into a near-deserted parking lot beside the park, shutting off the engine of her old sedan with a sigh. The dashboard clock glowed 2:17 a.m., far past when she should have been home. Her shoulders ached, stiff from another grueling shift at the child services office, but the exhaustion was more than physical. It was bone deep, the kind that made her stomach feel hollow. The bark came again, closer this time. She hesitated, her fingers still wrapped around the steering wheel. There was something unsettling about a lone dog barking at this hour, something off about the way its voice cut through the silence. Call it instinct, call it years of dealing with things people wish to ignore, but Ms. Calloway knew better than to brush off a bad feeling. Pushing open the car door, she stepped out into the cold, the air biting through the thin fabric of her sweater. Her shoes crunched against the gravel as she moved toward the source of the sound, her breath visible in the dim glow of the streetlights. The park stretched out before her, deserted, save for the skeletal outline of empty benches and leafless trees swaying under the weight of the wind. And then she saw it. A small bundle. At first, it barely registered. A pile of discarded blankets, perhaps, something left behind by the homeless who occasionally passed through. But then the fabric moved, just slightly, rustled by the wind or by something else. Her heartbeat quickened. The dog, a mangy-looking stray with ribs pressing against its thin fur, stood a few feet away, watching her with wary eyes. It whined low in its throat before pacing anxiously in place, its tail flicking. Miss Calloway took a step closer, then another. When she reached the bench, she hesitated before kneeling beside it, her breath catching in her throat. The blanket was thin and old, its edges frayed, wrapped tightly around something impossibly small. With careful fingers, she peeled it back. A baby. Her breath left her in a single sharp gasp. He was so still. For a terrifying moment, she thought, "No, please, not like this." Then the faintest movement, a flutter of white lashes, the softest parting of lips. He blinked up at her, his milky blue eyes wide, confused and uncomprehending. His skin was pale, too pale, and when she touched his tiny fingers, they were ice cold. "Oh, baby," she murmured, her voice breaking on the last syllable. Instinct kicked in before logic. She scooped him up, pressing him against her chest, tucking him into the warmth of her coat. He was so light, so fragile, his breaths barely noticeable against her collarbone. The sirens were coming now, distant but growing louder. Someone must have heard the barking and called it in. Miss Calloway swallowed hard, her fingers tightening protectively around the baby. She had seen too many things in her line of work: children left in hospital waiting rooms, infants abandoned on doorsteps, cases where neglect bled into outright cruelty. But this was different. This was deliberate. Someone had placed him here, in the open, exposed to the elements. Someone had walked away. She looked down at the baby, at the thin wisp of white hair that curled against his forehead. The contrast between the blanket's dark fabric and his unnaturally pale skin made him look almost otherworldly, like something that had wandered out of a dream and into a world that had no place for him. The wind howled through the trees, sending a shiver down her spine. The dog, still watching, let out a soft whimper before slinking away into the night. The sirens were almost upon them now. Red and blue lights painted the sidewalk in flashes of color. Miss Calloway didn't look up as the first officer approached. She only rocked the baby gently, holding him tighter as she whispered into the crook of his tiny ear, "You're safe now, little one." And for the first time that night, she allowed herself to believe it. The walls of the orphanage hummed with laughter. The sharp, high-pitched voices of children bounced off the worn wooden floors, mingling with the occasional thud of running feet and the scrape of plastic chairs shifting against linoleum. A ball ricocheted off a bookshelf, sending a cascade of picture books tumbling to the ground, met with an eruption of giggles. Henry sat cross-legged in the farthest corner of the room, away from the chaos, a box of crayons beside him. His fingers moved steadily, carefully pressing color into the thick paper beneath him. Emerald green for the leaves, a bold sunset streaking across the sky, a home he had never known but could imagine in vivid detail. His world was built through colors, ones that did not exist for him in real life, but spilled onto the page like tiny, desperate prayers. He heard them before he felt their presence. "Ghost boy," a voice whispered from across the room, laced with the kind of amusement only children could craft from cruelty. "No color, no shadow." Another snickered, emboldened. "Maybe he's not even real." Henry didn't look up. He never did. Reacting only gave them reason to continue. Instead, he reached for the deep blue crayon and pressed it against the edge of the paper, drawing the sloping lines of a river. His shoulders remained steady, his breathing even. He had learned long ago that silence was his best defense. But he was not invisible. Across the courtyard, beyond the cracked glass of the orphanage window, Gregory Harrington watched. A few minutes earlier, Gregory stepped out of his sleek black car, the orphanage director greeting him at the door. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with streaks of silver threading through his dark hair. His suit, crisp and perfectly tailored, fit him as effortlessly as the quiet authority he carried. There was no wasted movement in the way he adjusted his cufflinks, no hesitation in his measured strides. Everything about him spoke of a life meticulously controlled. And yet, he had never quite mastered the art of pretending he wasn't profoundly alone. He visited orphanages often. Donations, inspections, financial reports. He handled them all with the same detached efficiency as a business acquisition. He wrote checks without a second thought and shook hands with gratitude that felt rehearsed. But it was never personal, never more than a gesture. Until today. A flicker of movement in the courtyard pulled his attention. Among the scattered clusters of children, one figure remained separate from the rest. A boy, seated on the pavement, bent over a sheet of paper. His hair was pale, unnaturally so, catching the light like spun silver. His skin was almost translucent, a stark contrast to the world around him. Gregory observed him for a long moment. He wasn't like the others, not laughing, not running, not even acknowledging the noise around him. "Who's that?" Gregory asked, his voice even, but his gaze didn't waver. The director hesitated before answering. "That's Henry." Gregory waited, sensing there was more. The director sighed. "He's been here since infancy. No known family, no adoption inquiries." Gregory glanced at her. "Why?" A pause. "People hesitate. His condition makes him stand out. Some families believe he'll have medical complications. Others worry he'll struggle to fit in." Gregory studied the boy again, the way he focused, entirely absorbed in his drawing, unbothered by the world that had so easily ignored him. "Has he noticed me?" "No." Gregory stepped forward. Henry's fingers tightened around his crayon when he sensed the shift in the air. Someone had entered his space. Not the children. He knew their presence by the sharp-edged whispers that usually preceded them. This was different. He could feel the weight of the gaze, heavier than the usual fleeting glances of visitors passing through. He let out a slow breath before looking up. The man standing before him was tall and sharply dressed, carrying himself with the kind of stillness that commanded attention. His eyes, a dark, unreadable brown, studied Henry with neither pity nor forced kindness. Henry blinked. He was used to polite smiles and soft words meant to comfort. But this man simply looked, as though he were trying to solve something rather than fix it. Gregory crouched down, balancing his forearms on his knees. His eyes flicked to the drawing. "You like to paint," he observed, his voice low and smooth. Henry nodded once. His posture remained polite and careful as he placed his crayon down and sat up straighter. "Yes, sir," he answered softly. Gregory's brow lifted slightly at the formality. He glanced back at the director. "He's polite." She smiled faintly. "Very." Henry waited, uncertain why this man lingered when so many others moved past him without a second thought. Gregory tapped a finger against the edge of the drawing, noting the detail, the care. "This place," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Is it real?" Henry hesitated before answering. "Not yet." Gregory considered that answer longer than he should have. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen. With one smooth motion, he uncapped it and scrawled something on the corner of Henry's drawing before handing it back. Henry looked down. A number, a signature. Gregory stood, his gaze still steady. "I'll be back." The words were simple, devoid of promises, and yet they settled into Henry's chest with unexpected weight. Gregory turned, walking toward the orphanage office. Henry sat frozen, staring after him. For the first time in years, someone had looked at him and seen something, and that terrified him more than anything else. The orphanage smelled of chalk dust and faint traces of detergent, the kind that never quite masked the scent of old wood and time-worn furniture. Outside, the sun hung low, spilling golden light through the smudged windows, casting long, uneven shadows across the tiled floors. A distant clang of metal trays in the dining hall echoed through the hallways, blending with the constant murmur of voices, small, excited, restless. Gregory Harrington adjusted the cuffs of his coat as he stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking softly against the linoleum. He had been here before, many times in fact. Each visit had been routine, discussing funding with the director, reviewing reports, and ensuring the facility remained well maintained. A transaction, nothing more. Today should have been no different. But something about this visit felt less like an obligation and more like unfinished business. The director greeted him with a practiced smile, a clipboard tucked under her arm. "Mr. Harrington, thank you again for your continued generosity." Gregory gave a polite nod, glancing briefly at the papers she offered, budget allocations, renovation plans. He skimmed them with the efficiency of a man who had long mastered the art of reading between the lines. "Anything urgent?" he asked, already sensing the answer. The director hesitated. Then, almost as an afterthought, she glanced toward the courtyard. "There's one thing. A boy. Henry. I believe you met him last time. The boy that you said we should pay more attention to." Gregory's posture remained unreadable, but his eyes flicked toward the window before she continued. "He's in good health," she assured him, "but his eating habits are inconsistent. He eats little and has trouble sleeping. Nightmares, we think, though he never speaks of them." Gregory folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "And the other children?" The director hesitated. "He keeps to himself." That much Gregory had already observed. He had seen Henry before, sitting alone, untouched by the usual chaos of childhood, as if he existed in a different rhythm from those around him. He didn't fit. Not because he couldn't, but because the world had already decided he wouldn't. Gregory nodded, dismissing the reports with a single gesture. "I'll take a look around." The courtyard buzzed with life. Children rushed toward the volunteers, their faces bright with anticipation, their hands eagerly reaching for the candy and toys being distributed. The air was thick with the sound of chatter, laughter, and the occasional squeal of delight as someone unwrapped a new gift. Henry remained still. He sat cross-legged on the pavement, his crayon gliding steadily across the paper on his lap. A house, large and grand, took shape beneath his fingers. He shaded the windows dark, leaving the inside empty. Gregory watched. The boy did not look up, did not react to the flurry of movement around him. His focus was unshaken, absorbed in a world no one else could see. Gregory exhaled slowly before stepping forward. He did not speak. Instead, he reached into the paper bag in his hand and set a sandwich down beside Henry. The boy stilled for a fraction of a second, his grip on the crayon tightening. Then, finally, he looked up. Their eyes met, one searching, the other unreadable. Henry's gaze flickered briefly to the sandwich, then back to the man before him. His expression remained neutral, but there was something beneath it, a quiet wariness, the kind that came from knowing nothing was ever given without reason. Gregory's eyes dropped to the drawing, a house, large, grand, but empty. Something tightened in his chest. "You don't like the candy?" Gregory asked, his tone even. Henry hesitated before shaking his head. "I prefer sandwiches." His voice was soft, deliberate. Gregory raised an eyebrow. "Smart choice." A long pause. Then Henry, still uncertain, reached for the sandwich. He unwrapped it carefully, taking a small, measured bite. Gregory watched as the boy chewed slowly, thoughtfully, before lowering his gaze back to the drawing. Silence stretched between them, unhurried, comfortable. Then, without looking up, Henry spoke again. "I think houses feel lonely," he said simply, "when no one lives in them." Gregory's breath stilled for a fraction of a second. He glanced down at the picture again, at the darkened windows, at the empty space within. He recognized that emptiness. He had lived in it for years. Henry lifted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. But something about the way he observed Gregory, calm, unwavering, felt heavier than it should. Gregory exhaled, standing up slowly. "See you later, son," he said, adjusting his coat. Henry nodded once, his fingers tightening slightly around the sandwich. Gregory turned and walked away, but even as he stepped inside the orphanage, the image of that empty house stayed with him. The city blurred past the car windows, streaks of neon and streetlights, painting the dark roads in fractured colors. The rhythmic hum of the engine filled the silence, punctuated only by the occasional hiss of tires against damp pavement. Gregory Harrington sat in the back seat, his fingers resting lightly against the leather armrest, his mind elsewhere. Through the tinted glass, the orphanage faded into the distance. On instinct, he turned his head, catching one last glimpse of the place before it disappeared. "Something on your mind, sir?" The voice came from the front. Reynolds, his driver of nearly 20 years, kept his eyes on the road, but had long mastered the art of reading his employer's silence. Gregory exhaled, his gaze shifting back to the city. "There was a boy," he said simply. Reynolds nodded once, waiting. "He reminded me of someone I used to know," Gregory continued after a pause. "Thin, quiet, kept to himself, the kind of child people look at but don't see." There was a weight in those words, something old and buried. Reynolds, familiar with the careful distance Gregory kept from personal matters, said nothing. He merely nodded, navigating the car smoothly through the empty streets. Gregory leaned back, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He hadn't thought about it in years, the boy he had once been. Small, sickly, always a step behind the others. The one who had learned early that kindness was often followed by conditions, that loneliness was a safer companion than hope. The memory settled in his chest like a stone. The mansion loomed in the darkness, its towering iron gates parting soundlessly as the car rolled up the long driveway. The house itself was breathtaking, a masterpiece of architectural brilliance, sprawling yet precise, a testament to the power and wealth Gregory had amassed over decades. But it was quiet. Inside, the walls were adorned with masterpieces, canvases worth more than most people's homes, portraits, landscapes, abstract swirls of color, all meticulously curated, all carefully chosen, and yet not a single one bore the image of a person he knew. No family portraits, no childhood photographs. It was a house of things, not of memories. Gregory shrugged off his coat, draping it over the back of a chair as he moved toward the bar in the corner of the study. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the glow of the chandelier above. The glass felt cool in his grip, solid, grounding. But his mind wasn't in the room. It was still at the orphanage, the way the boy had sat there, cross-legged, lost in his drawing while the world bustled around him. The way he had looked up, not expectant, not hopeful, just observing, calculating, as if waiting to see if Gregory would be another face that came and went. Gregory swirled the drink in his glass, staring into its depths, as though the answer lay there. He had no reason to go back. His donations were made, his obligations fulfilled. And yet, when the sun rose the next morning, he found himself standing at the orphanage gates once again. The headmistress studied him with barely concealed surprise. "Mr. Harrington," she greeted, folding her hands over the paperwork she had been reviewing. "Back so soon?" Gregory adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, his tone even. "I need to ask about Henry." The woman's expression faltered slightly, though she masked it quickly. "Henry? Is there a problem?" Gregory ignored the question. "Tell me more about him." She hesitated, then exhaled. "As you know, he's quiet, well-mannered, very independent for his age." A pause. "He doesn't have much of an appetite, though. He eats little and has trouble sleeping. The caretakers think he has nightmares, but he won't talk about them." Gregory's jaw tightened slightly. "And adoption inquiries?" The woman sighed, leaning back in her chair. "None." That was enough. "I'll take him." The statement hung in the air, stark and final. The headmistress blinked as though she hadn't heard him correctly. You want to adopt Henry?" "Yes." Gregory said it without hesitation this time. The woman hesitated, searching his face as if looking for some sign of uncertainty. "Mr. Harrington, this isn't a business deal. Have you—" "I've considered it." A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I'll start the paperwork." Henry was called into the office later that afternoon. He stepped inside quietly, his hands clasped neatly in front of him, posture straight but cautious. His pale lashes flickered upward as he took in the sight of Gregory standing near the window, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. The headmistress offered a kind smile. "Henry, dear, we have some news for you." The boy remained still, waiting. "Mr. Harrington has decided to take you home with him." For a long moment there was no reaction. No widened eyes, no gasp of excitement, no flurry of movement. Just silence. Then, finally, Henry turned his gaze toward Gregory. "Okay," he said softly. No hesitation, no fear. Just quiet acceptance, as if he had already learned that life did not offer choices, only outcomes. Gregory studied him, then extended his hand. Henry hesitated for the first time. His small fingers twitched slightly before, finally, he reached forward and took it. And in that moment, Gregory realized, perhaps neither of them had expected this, but it was happening all the same. The iron gates groaned open, revealing a long, winding driveway flanked by towering hedges. The car moved slowly, the gravel crunching under the tires as they approached the estate. Henry sat in the back seat, silent, his small hands folded neatly in his lap. From the window, he watched the mansion come into view, an imposing structure of stone and glass, standing against the night like a fortress. It was beautiful, but not in the way he imagined home should be. There was no warmth, no soft glow of lights in the windows, no sign of life. Just cold, elegant perfection. Gregory sat beside him, unreadable as always. The man had not spoken much since they left the orphanage, and Henry had not asked any questions. He had learned long ago that silence was easier. The car stopped in front of the grand entrance. A butler opened the door for them, and Henry stepped out cautiously, his shoes barely making a sound against the polished stone. Inside, the house swallowed him whole. The ceilings stretched too high, the walls pristine and untouched, decorated with paintings that must have cost more than the orphanage itself. The floors gleamed under the soft lighting, immaculate and cold. Every object was placed with purpose, every surface spotless. There were no family photos, no signs of anyone who had lived here before. Henry turned slightly, glancing at Gregory, who had removed his coat and handed it off to the butler. He seemed at ease, accustomed to the vastness. But to Henry, the silence of the house felt heavier than the walls themselves. A woman in a crisp black dress approached. A housekeeper, he assumed. She smiled, polite but distant. "Welcome home, young master," she said. Home. Henry didn't know what that word meant anymore. He nodded slightly, murmuring a quiet "thank you" before following Gregory further into the house. The staff watched him with a mixture of curiosity and reservation. They were polite, addressing him with quiet courtesy, but Henry could tell he was a guest here, not a resident. Not yet. Gregory led him up a grand staircase, the railings dark and polished, the chandelier above casting delicate patterns against the marble floor below. At the end of the hallway, he stopped in front of a large wooden door and pushed it open. "This is your room," he said simply. Henry stepped inside. The room was bigger than any he had ever slept in. The bed was large, too large for him, with neatly pressed sheets and pillows arranged just so. There was a desk against the far wall, a wide window overlooking the garden below. The curtains were thick, heavy, designed to block out the world. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. Henry felt his fingers twitch slightly at his sides. He wasn't used to this. At the orphanage, he had shared a room with 6 other boys, the space always filled with movement, with noise. This was empty. Gregory cleared his throat. "If you need anything, the staff will take care of it." Henry turned to look at him. "Yes, sir," he said politely. Gregory hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if about to say something more, but then he nodded once and stepped back. "Get some rest." Then he was gone. The door closed with a quiet click. Henry stood there for a moment, before walking over to the bed. He placed his small bag on the floor beside it, untouched. He sat down, the mattress sinking slightly beneath his weight, but it felt too firm, too unfamiliar. Henry exhaled softly, then stood up again. He walked toward the desk, where a blank sheet of paper sat waiting. The boy reached into his bag, pulling out the small, well-worn box of crayons he had brought with him. Then slowly, he began to draw. "Leave a comment, cotton candy, if you are wishing Henry a happy life." The days passed in careful silence. Gregory, unsure of how to interact with a child, kept his distance. Henry did not ask for anything, did not make a fuss. He ate quietly, though he never finished his meals. He did not run through the halls or explore the house with the curiosity of most children. Instead, he painted. The first time Gregory noticed, he had been passing by the study late one evening. Through the open door, he saw Henry sitting on the floor, a blank canvas in front of him. The boy's small fingers moved carefully, dipping a brush into watercolors, his strokes precise and deliberate. Gregory did not enter. He watched from the doorway, unnoticed. The painting was of a house. Not his mansion. Something smaller, cozier, painted in warm shades of gold and brown. There was a light glowing from the windows, soft and welcoming. It was nothing like the place they were in now. Something in Gregory's chest tightened, an unfamiliar ache. He said nothing. But the next day, when he passed the study again, there was a new canvas leaning against the wall, and another the day after that. Slowly, the empty house began to change. Bit by bit, Henry filled the walls with color. The evening stretched long, the sky outside darkening into ink-stained velvet. A fire flickered in the grand fireplace of Gregory's study, casting restless shadows against the polished wood-paneled walls. The air smelled of aged whiskey and the faint scent of oil paint, a lingering presence ever since Henry had started transforming the house in quiet, unspoken ways. Gregory sat in his leather chair, nursing a drink, the golden liquid swirling lazily against the glass. The mansion was silent, save for the occasional crackle of embers, the low hum of the central heating system, and the soft scratching of a crayon against paper. Henry was on the floor near the coffee table, sketchbook open, his small hands moving methodically, layering blues and greys into something Gregory couldn't quite see yet. He had long since learned that the boy preferred to exist in silence. That conversation was something Henry engaged in only when necessary. Gregory found he didn't mind. A sharp knock on the door shattered the peace. Gregory exhaled slowly, setting down his glass. "Come in." The door swung open, and Vincent Gibson strolled in, his presence commanding and effortlessly loud. He was dressed in an expensive suit, the scent of his cologne arriving a second before he did, thick and intrusive. His grin was easy, but his eyes were sharp as ever, assessing the room before landing on the child sitting on the floor. "Well, I'll be damned." Vincent let out a short laugh. "Didn't know you were into charity cases, Greg." Henry's crayon paused for a fraction of a second before continuing. Gregory's jaw tensed, but his voice remained even. "You were never very good at small talk, Vincent. Get to the point." Vincent smirked, stepping further inside. "Relax. I'm just surprised. You, of all people, with a kid?" He gestured toward Henry with a careless wave of his hand. "What's the story? One of those tax write-off situations?" Henry remained silent, his posture unchanged, though Gregory didn't miss the way his grip tightened slightly on the crayon. Gregory's patience was thin. "He's here because I chose for him to be here. That's all you need to know." Vincent clicked his tongue, shaking his head. "Didn't peg you for the sentimental type." Before Gregory could respond, another figure appeared in the doorway. "Vincent," a woman's voice interrupted, smooth but cautious. "Marilyn." She was younger than Vincent by a decade at least, dressed in a sleek midnight blue dress that clung to her frame in effortless elegance. Her heels barely made a sound as she stepped inside, but something in her eyes sharpened the moment she took in the scene, and then her gaze landed on Henry. She froze. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't blink. Henry looked up then, his silver hair catching the warm light of the fire, his pale features impassive as he met her stare. Something inside Marilyn shifted, a ripple of recognition passing through her before she could stop it. Gregory caught the way her knuckles tightened against the clutch in her hand, the way her breath hitched for just a second too long. Vincent, oblivious, took another sip of his drink, chuckling. "Well, we should toast to your new little ward, huh? What's his name, anyway?" Henry didn't speak. Gregory did. "Henry." Vincent gave an exaggerated nod, leaning back against the desk. "Henry, right. Well, I hope the kid isn't expecting bedtime stories, because you were never much for parenting material, Greg." Gregory ignored him, his attention still on Marilyn. She hadn't moved. She was still staring at Henry, her expression unreadable, but something behind her eyes looked close to breaking. Henry tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady, as if he, too, was trying to solve something unspoken between them. Marilyn swallowed, her throat working against the silence. Then, abruptly, she turned to Gregory. "Can I get a glass of water or wine?" Gregory didn't miss the tremor in her voice. He gestured toward the bar. "Help yourself." She nodded, too quickly, and walked past them, her movements controlled but just slightly off, like a marionette whose strings had been pulled too tight. Gregory leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Something wasn't right, and whatever it was, it had everything to do with Henry. Marilyn's fingers tightened around the base of her wine glass. The liquid inside barely moved, yet she felt unsteady, as though the entire room had tilted beneath her feet. The firelight flickered against the polished walls, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to grow and shrink with each breath she took. Across the room, Henry sat quietly, his small figure partially illuminated by the warm glow of the fireplace. He was still drawing, his head bent in quiet concentration, silver hair spilling over his forehead. The sight of him unsettled her in a way she could not explain, or rather, in a way she did understand, but refused to acknowledge. She took a careful sip of her wine, willing the warmth of the alcohol to steady her nerves, but it did nothing to quell the chill pressing against her spine. Her eyes traced Henry's features again, the soft curve of his nose, the way his pale eyelashes fluttered slightly when he glanced at his drawing, the distant yet thoughtful expression that never quite left his face. It wasn't possible. And yet, a memory surged forward, unbidden, raw in its clarity. A sterile hospital room, the sharp scent of antiseptic, a wailing infant, small and frail, with hair so pale it looked almost translucent beneath the fluorescent lights. The bastard ex-boyfriend ran away earlier. Her own hands trembled as she set the child down, a door closing behind her, sealing away a part of herself forever. She forced herself to exhale slowly. Number. It's impossible. It's been years. And yet, the resemblance gnawed at her, whispering through her bones, demanding that she know, exactly like her first man 10 years ago. A mistake of youth. She was suddenly aware of Gregory watching her. His dark eyes were steady, unreadable, as if he had already picked apart the hesitation in her movements, the fraction of a second too long she had stared at Henry. She met his gaze, forcing a polite smile. "You never mentioned you had taken in a child." Gregory studied her for a moment before responding. "I don't make a habit of explaining my personal affairs." Marilyn's grip tightened on her glass, but she let out a soft, practiced laugh. "Of course. It just caught me off guard." She glanced toward Henry again, forcing her voice into something light and indifferent. "He's quite unique." Gregory didn't answer, but the weight of his gaze remained. Vincent, oblivious as always, let out a scoff. "Yeah, unique's one way to put it. I mean, it's not every day you meet a kid who looks like that." He smirked, swirling the last of his whiskey. "You planning on keeping him, Greg? Or just fostering him until the novelty wears off?" The tension in the room stretched thin. Henry did not react to the words, his crayon never pausing, but Gregory's expression turned to granite. Marilyn's stomach twisted. For all of Vincent's callousness, the words echoed something darker inside her. She needed to be sure. The night passed in slow, deliberate motions. Dinner was served in the grand dining hall, a lavish affair of silverware clinking against porcelain, soft conversations that skimmed over anything real. Marilyn went through the motions, answering Vincent's occasional remarks, responding when spoken to, but her mind remained elsewhere. She watched Henry, the way he ate carefully, never wasting a movement, the way his eyes flicked up every so often, not out of curiosity but calculation, as if constantly assessing the world around him. He did not fidget, did not demand attention. He simply was. Something inside her clenched. The evening drew to a close, and as Vincent busied himself finishing a brandy in Gregory's study, Marilyn excused herself under the guise of freshening up. She did not go to the bathroom. Instead, she walked quietly down the hallway, the grand corridors stretching long and silent ahead of her. She didn't know what she was looking for, proof reassurance, an answer she didn't want, but needed all the same. Then, through an open doorway, she saw him. Henry stood at his desk, putting away his crayons. The room was dimly lit, soft pools of golden light casting his small shadow against the walls. She hesitated in the hallway, her pulse hammering. It had to be done quickly. She took a step inside. Henry's back remained to her, his small hands stacking his papers neatly, unaware of her presence. Or so she thought. "I don't like people touching my things," he said suddenly, his voice quiet but precise. Marilyn froze. Slowly, Henry turned, his pale blue eyes meeting hers. There was no accusation in them, no fear, just quiet observation, the kind that made her feel stripped bare. Her fingers curled slightly against her dress. "I was just passing by," she murmured, summoning a soft smile. Henry said nothing. Her heart pounded as she took a careful step closer. "Henry, may I see your hair?" A pause. A long one. Then, without a word, he nodded. Marilyn reached out, her fingers brushing against the fine strands of silver-white hair. And then, with delicate precision, she plucked a single strand. Henry did not flinch, but he did watch her. Marilyn swallowed hard, retreating a step. "You're a very polite boy," she said softly. Henry's expression did not change. "I try to be." She hesitated for a moment longer before forcing another smile. "Good night, Henry." Henry tilted his head slightly. "Good night, Mom." The word Mom hit somewhere deep inside her, but she ignored it, turning swiftly and exiting the room. She walked down the hallway, her pulse roaring in her ears, the single strand of hair clenched between her fingers. Tomorrow, she would find out the truth, even if she already knew the answer. The results came in a plain, white envelope. Marilyn's hands trembled as she held it, the edges of the paper digging into her palms. She hadn't slept since leaving Gregory's estate, hadn't been able to erase the image of Henry's pale blue eyes, his quiet stare, the way he had simply let her take a strand of his hair without question. She already knew. But knowing and proving were two very different things. The air in her bedroom was thick with silence, broken only by the soft rustling of paper as she unfolded the results. Her eyes scanned the document, her breath catching as she reached the only line that mattered. 99.99% probability. Her stomach twisted. The glass of water on her nightstand remained untouched. She reached for it with a trembling hand, but her fingers stopped inches away. The weight in her chest grew heavier, pressing down, suffocating. Henry was her son, the child she had abandoned, the child she had forced herself to forget. A dry, bitter laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. You didn't forget. You buried it. The life she had carefully constructed, the husband, the wealth, the polished perfection, felt fragile now, like glass about to shatter. She had told herself back then that she was making the right decision, that she was too young, too unprepared, that giving him up meant giving him a chance at something better. But had it? Had she saved him, or had she merely saved herself? She pressed a hand to her mouth, squeezing her eyes shut. This wasn't something she could ignore. She had to see Gregory. She arrived at the estate the next afternoon, her nails digging into her palms as she stood at the front door. The butler recognized her instantly and stepped aside without question. "Mr. Harrington is in his study," he said. Marilyn nodded, stepping inside. The house was as imposing as ever, but it felt different now, its grandeur oppressive rather than impressive. Her heels echoed against the marble floors as she made her way down the long hallway, her pulse a steady drumbeat in her ears. The study door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open. Gregory was seated behind his desk, flipping through a document, but the moment he saw her, his gaze sharpened. He set the papers down, his expression unreadable. "Marilyn!" His voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it. "This is unexpected." She closed the door behind her, swallowing hard. I need to talk to you." Gregory leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I figured as much." She hesitated, fingers tightening around the test results she had tucked into her coat pocket. Her voice was unsteady when she finally spoke. "It's Henry." Gregory's expression didn't change, but the air in the room shifted. She forced herself to continue. "I had a DNA test done." She exhaled sharply, as if saying it aloud made it more real. "He's mine." A heavy silence followed. Gregory didn't speak. He didn't move. His face remained unreadable, but his fingers curled slightly against the armrest of his chair. Marilyn pulled the test results from her pocket and placed them on his desk. Gregory didn't look at them. His gaze remained locked onto hers. "And now what?" His voice was low, dangerously calm. "You expect me to hand him over?" Marilyn's throat tightened. "No." The word was barely above a whisper. She shook her head, trying to steady herself. I want to know he'll be safe." Gregory finally looked down at the paper in front of him, his eyes scanning the result that confirmed what she had already said. Then, slowly, he exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Safe," he repeated, his tone edged with something unreadable. "That's an interesting word, coming from you." Marilyn flinched. She deserved that. She gripped the edge of the desk, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I made a mistake," she admitted. "A terrible one." Her voice cracked. "I was young, I was scared, and She inhaled sharply. "I walked away when I shouldn't have." She turned away from him, pressing her hands against her temples. "But I didn't come here to take him back. I wouldn't do that to him or to you." She swallowed hard, blinking against the tears burning in her eyes. I needed you to know the truth. And I needed to know that he's with someone who sees him." Gregory was silent for a long time. Then finally he spoke. "He's not going anywhere." Marilyn turned back toward him, her breath hitching. Gregory's gaze was unwavering. "You may have given birth to him, but I brought him home. I sat with him in silence when he couldn't sleep. I watched him paint the walls of a house that had never been a home before he arrived." His voice was steady, but there was something raw beneath it. "He is mine now." Marilyn let out a shuddering breath, nodding. "I know." Her voice was barely audible, but she meant it. She wasn't here to undo what Gregory had done. She just wanted to make peace with what she had done. She hesitated, then took another breath. "Please, just love him. Give him what I couldn't." Gregory's jaw tightened. The weight of her words settled between them. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he gave a slow, measured nod. "Fine." Relief coursed through her so intensely that she nearly staggered. She exhaled shakily, nodding. She had no right to ask for anything more. And so, without another word, she turned to leave. But before she reached the door, Gregory spoke again. "One condition." She stopped. He stood, crossing the room with slow, deliberate steps. When she turned to face him, his expression was unreadable, but there was something unrelenting in his eyes. "You do not tell him." Marilyn's stomach twisted. "Gregory, if you care about him as much as you claim to," he said, voice even, "you won't burden him with your guilt." Marilyn swallowed hard, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to argue, wanted to say that Henry had a right to know. But the truth was, she didn't know what was best for him. She had forfeited that right a long time ago, and Gregory hadn't. So, after a long, agonizing pause, she nodded. "Okay." Gregory didn't thank her, didn't soften. But as she left the room, she felt something shift. She had come here searching for closure. Instead, she had found something else entirely. Marilyn stood by the window, her fingers gripping the curtain edge as she watched the city lights flicker below. The apartment was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic. Vincent was asleep in the next room, unaware of the war waging inside her chest. The DNA results sat on the vanity, unopened since the day she had left Gregory's estate. She didn't need to read them again. The truth had already carved itself into her ribs, settling there like an ache she would carry for the rest of her life. Henry was hers, and she could never tell him. She had agreed to Gregory's condition. She had nodded, swallowed down every impulse to beg, to plead, to hold her son just once and whisper, "I'm sorry." But this was her atonement. To leave. To let him go. To convince Vincent that it was time to move. Time to start fresh somewhere else, away from the reminders of a past she had tried so hard to erase. Vincent had raised an eyebrow when she brought it up, but he didn't argue much. "A new city, huh?" he had mused, swirling his drink. "Well, I suppose the company could use my presence in another branch. But you sure about this?" Marilyn had smiled, the same effortless, polished smile she had perfected over the years. "Absolutely. I think it'll be good for us." He had shrugged. "All right then, sweetheart. Whatever you want." That was Vincent, always indulgent, always willing to bend to her whims, as long as they didn't disrupt his own sense of comfort. He didn't suspect a thing. And so, just like that, they left. But Marilyn knew she was not running towards something new. She was running away. The first year was unbearable. She had kept her word. She did not return. She threw herself into her new life, settling into their new home, redecorating, attending charity events, and smiling for the camera at Vincent's side. She played the part of the perfect wife, flawless and composed, as if nothing had changed. But something had. Because Henry was still there, in the back of her mind, a shadow she could not escape. His face, his quiet way of watching, his hands carefully coloring between the lines, her son, the child she had given away. As the months passed, the ache in her chest only grew, a gnawing guilt that festered in the silence of their sprawling penthouse, in the empty hours when Vincent was away. Then his birthday arrived, and she couldn't stay away. She returned in secret, slipping into the city unnoticed, her car stopping just beyond the estate's wrought iron gates. She stayed in the shadows, unseen, watching through the gaps in the towering fence. Henry was outside in the garden, seated on the grass with his sketchbook open, a paintbrush moving steadily across the page. The sun cast a soft glow over his silver hair, and for the first time in years, Marilyn saw him smile. He was different now, stronger, healthier, happy. Gregory stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching the boy with a quiet attentiveness. There was no impatience, no forced responsibility, only an unwavering presence, the kind that spoke of something unspoken but understood. Marilyn's breath caught in her throat. He had kept his promise. Henry had found something she could have never given him. A home. She watched for nearly an hour, standing in the cold, her hands trembling, her heart caught between sorrow and relief. Then, before she could let herself be seen, she turned and left. It became a ritual. Every year, on his birthday, she returned. She never stepped inside. She never spoke to him. She never let him see her. But she was there, watching from the edges of his world, an invisible presence, lingering just long enough to reassure herself that he was okay. And he was. She saw him grow, taller, more confident. She saw the way his paintings evolved, from simple shapes to breathtaking landscapes, to portraits of people who were not her. She watched as Gregory became the father Henry needed, guiding him through the years with steady patience. And every year, it got harder. Because Henry was happy, because Gregory had done what she could not, because she had made the right choice. And yet, the ache never left. The what-ifs never stopped whispering. She was not his mother, not in the way that mattered. She was just a stranger watching from behind the glass. And that, she told herself, would have to be enough. The mansion no longer felt like a museum. Once, its walls had been adorned only with expensive, lifeless artwork, cold masterpieces chosen for their value rather than their meaning. Now, every hallway, every room, every empty space had been touched by color. Henry's paintings covered the house like ivy, reclaiming abandoned ruins. Sunsets draped in fiery golds and deep purples, bustling city streets, alive with faceless figures, cozy homes glowing warmly in the night. And in the study, hanging over Gregory's desk, a portrait of the mansion itself, but with light in the windows, with laughter painted into the shadows. It was no longer just a house. It was his home now. Henry sat at the breakfast table, spooning cereal into his mouth absent-mindedly, his sketchbook beside his plate. He had grown taller over the years, his features sharper, but his quiet intensity remained. Gregory sat across from him, sipping his coffee, pretending not to watch as the boy hummed softly to himself. A habit he'd picked up recently, one Gregory secretly found endearing. Henry looked up suddenly. "Dad?" Gregory froze. The word had slipped out naturally, as if it had always belonged there. Henry didn't seem to notice his hesitation, flipping a page in his sketchbook as he spoke. "I was thinking we should repaint the kitchen. The white makes it feel kind of empty." Gregory set down his coffee. "And what color would you suggest?" Henry tapped his pencil against the table. "Something warm, maybe yellow, like sunshine." Gregory smirked. "That's a bit cheerful for my taste." Henry grinned. "Yeah, well, you live with me now. Get used to it." Gregory shook his head, but he didn't argue. If the boy wanted warmth, then warmth he would have. He cleared his throat. "Speaking of which, your birthday is coming up." Henry perked up slightly. "Yeah. Anything special you want?" Henry shrugged. "I don't know, just cake, I guess." Gregory raised an eyebrow. "No gift requests?" Henry thought for a moment, then smirked. "Okay, maybe some new paints, and a huge canvas, like really huge." Gregory chuckled. "Done." Henry beamed, and Gregory swore it was the brightest thing in the room. That evening, a familiar car pulled up to the estate. Marilyn stepped out, wrapped in a tailored coat, her fingers curled around the gift in her hands. The weight of it felt heavier than it should. She had made peace with her role, an outsider, a visitor, a spectator in her own son's life. But that didn't stop the ache from settling in her ribs every time she saw him. The door opened before she knocked. "Come in," Gregory said. She stepped inside, inhaling the scent of old wood, faintly mixed with something new. Paint, she realized. The house was different. The walls were different. It was no longer just marble and wealth. It was alive. Gregory led her to the study. Henry sat cross-legged on the floor, paint streaked across his hands, a half-finished canvas in front of him. He turned at the sound of footsteps. Marilyn smiled. "Happy birthday, Henry." He returned her smile, easy and polite. "Thanks." She knelt down, extending the book in her hands. "I got you something." Henry took it, studying the cover, an art collection of rare classical pieces. His fingers brushed over the pages, admiration flickering in his eyes. "Whoa, this is amazing." Marilyn swallowed against the lump in her throat. "I thought you'd like it," he grinned. "I love it." "Thank you." Gregory watched from the doorway, arms crossed. Marilyn looked at him, her gaze soft but knowing. She would never tell Henry the truth. That was the promise she had made. But she would be here, every year, watching, loving him from the only distance she was allowed. And Henry, blissfully unaware, smiled, content in the only home he had ever known. Gregory exhaled, something deep settling in his chest. This, not his wealth, not his business, was his greatest investment. And for the first time in years, he felt whole. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.